Charles, we've known each other a long time, but I'm not sure that I know when and where you were born. Could you tell me?
I was born on 13th of May 1940 in a village called Macfarlane in Hertfordshire, and my mother left London because of the potential of bombing to have me in the country, and her father was a great friend of the Norman family, Montague Norman in particular, who had been governor of the Bank of England. And in fact, I was born in what I think of as the gardener's cottage, but a small house in the grounds of Moor Place, which was where Montague Norman lived after I was born, from about 1944 till he died in 1950.
Right. Well, let's go back a few generations, as far as you like. I know that some of your relatives were famed anthropologists and invented bank holidays and things like that, and others were baronets and things. So just go back as far as you like and tell me about a few of your ancestors, or your grandparents or whatever.
Both of my grandfathers were distinguished in their own ways, but particularly my mother's father, Cecil Lubbock, who had been head boy of Eton, was runner-up in the Newcastle Classics Prize, got a good first in Greats at Oxford, and then went on to be managing director and later chairman of Whitbreads, the brewers, and also went on to the court of the Bank of England in 1907 and remained on the court till 1942, an extraordinary period to be involved in, right at the centre of the British financial system. And he and Montague Norman, who became governor, the very famous governor immediately after the First War, were very, very close friends, and there is an extraordinary correspondence between them which has survived. Cecil Lubbock was regarded by his four daughters and his son as something near to a saint, and in fact he was regarded by a very large number of people as having saint-like qualities, because he was an extraordinarily accomplished, erudite man, and yet he had that absolute natural modesty and goodness which I think you have to be born with. I'm not sure you can learn it. And in a way, he's a kind of difficult figure to feel close, particularly close to, because of this kind of essential goodness which most of us don't have. I was always very fond of him, but don't remember a huge amount about him, though I was 15 when he died, 16 actually. My other grandfather was not such a good man, but in many ways I feel closer to him because he was inventive, energetic, loved photography, which I do too. And in some ways I remember him as a much more rounded, colourful figure than Cecil. But I have, in the last few years, written a very short biography of Cecil Lubbock because I thought his business career was so interesting and hadn't really been touched on. And I doubt if I'll do the same for Gerald Chadwyck-Healey, my other grandfather. Gerald.
Oh, Gerald.
Gerald was interesting because he, in about 1907, about the same time, 1907, 1908, he raised money to back an inventor called Hollerith, who had invented the punched card machine. And the government decided to use that system for the 1910 census. So it was a very, very big contract. And Gerald Chadwyck-Healey set up a company called the International Tabulating Machine Company to enable the Hollerith system to be used. And he and certainly one of his half-brothers were directors of ITC through the 30s and into the 40s. And by the end of the 30s, he had become quite a good friend of Thomas Watson, the founder of IBM. And tantalizingly, there is a record in the published history of ICL, which is what the International Tabulating Machine Company became, of my father, Charles Chadwyck-Healey, as a young man who spent some time in America, staying with the Watsons as a house guest. But by the time I read this, both my father and every other member of the family who might have known something about it were dead, and I can't find out anything about it at all. ICT had the rights to sell IBM computers or machines throughout the world, outside North America and probably South America. But at the end of the war, IBM realized that that was a right that they did not want to pass over to anybody else, so it was just withdrawn, taken back.
You didn't have to buy it back, they just...
I think the way American business worked at the end of the war was that if you wanted something back, you just took it, because Britain wasn't in a position to argue very strongly.
Do you think, immediately one sees a connection between that and the own firm that you set up, which is in the rough field of information preservation, documentation, dissemination, etc., not with IBM cards but with other forms? Do you think it flowed down to you indirectly?
Yes, I do. My great-great-grandfather, Charles Healey, came from Rochdale in Lancashire, where and there is a Healey Hall and there is a Chadwyck Hall, or have been in the past. There is a Healey Hall in existence now in Rochdale. So they were not poor people who came south. He came from a respectable kind of yeoman family. But he had invented a steam valve, and he came to London to sell it, and published some kind of newsletter or pamphlet describing this steam valve. The steam valve, as far as I know, never did sell, but he then decided to start a magazine which was called The Engineer. It was the world's first engineering magazine. It was weekly, and it is still weekly to this day, so The Engineer still exists. And that was the family business through the 19th century. And the name of the company was The Engineer.
He was the first Viscount, was that?
No, his son, also Charles Healey, decided that his son was a barrister, a specialist in patent law, and is probably the most interesting and the most able member of the Chadwyck-Healey family of any generation. He went to Berkhamsted Grammar School. He did not go to university, but he ended in his adulthood. He was a remarkable amateur historian. He was secretary of the Somerset Record Society. Yes. He wrote books on
church law,
on the history of Norman law, and he wrote a book on local history on Somerset. And he was a watercolourist, and he was a collector of paintings, books, particularly books, and Bibles, and including Bibles, I should say, and clocks. Some of his collecting was, in my view, of a Victorian magpie type of collecting, and that he didn't, sadly, collect always the very best things. But his book collecting had a surer hand, and unfortunately most of the books were bought actually by Phillips, and ended up in the Phillips collection. That was mainly 17th century travel. And he owned a lot of houses. So he was a very, very wealthy man. He had, and he did this through first inheriting the family company, and second being a successful barrister. So he had a large private yacht. He was a very keen sailor, and he and the Duke of Montrose, in the end of the 19th century, started the RNVR, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. The idea being that there was going to be a war with Germany. The Navy was going to be an important part of it. and that it would be appropriate for gentlemen sailors to be trained or to be ready to join the Navy in the event of a crisis. And the professional working sailors joined the RNR, Royal Naval Reserve. So immediately you get that kind of social differentiation, even with things like the two reserves. He decided, I think in the 1890s, that he would add to his name, because he decided he was as much part of the Chadwick family in Rochdale as he was Healey, so he would join the two names together. And he actually paid a fee to the Royal College of Heralds to do that, and just simply changed his name. And he had to pay the fee again 10 years later. It was one of those things that you just had to repeat from time to time. And then in 1919 he was made a baronet, and but died at the end of that year. But he had been made a CMG earlier, so he already had a title, a lifetime title. And I think he probably got either his baronetcy or his CMG because he was the chairman of a Royal Commission on Mental Health, which I think took place either just before or during the First War, and is something I've always meant to kind of go back and look at. So he was a very, very interesting man.
There's a long article on him in Wikipedia, at least not a long one. There is an interesting article. I thought it was you at first, so I discovered he was the editor of the Engineer.
So my grandfather, Gerald, wanted to go to South Africa with people like Cecil Rhodes and make his fortune there, and his father wouldn't allow him to do so. He had to stay at home and run the family company, which he did, along with his exploits with Hollerith. His eldest son, who fought in the First War and survived and got the MC, my uncle Edward Chadwyck-Healey, decided he didn't want to work with his father, so his younger brother, my father, also entered the family firm, which by that time was called Morgan Brothers, because they had amalgamated in the 30s with another family publishing company, which published magazines like The Chemist and Druggist, The Ironmonger, and good kind of trade weeklies. In 1940, my grandfather started electronic engineering. The Electronic Engineer, which was pretty prescient and was an extremely successful trade magazine. I went to Eton in 1953, I was sent to Eton in 1953, and probably when I was about 17, my housemaster said to me, "You'll work in the family firm, won't you?" And I said, "No, sir." I knew by then that it wasn't going to be work for me. I didn't want to go into a family firm and feel that everything had already been kind of done for me. I didn't particularly want to work with my father, mainly because I didn't, even at that age, I sensed that we wouldn't necessarily work terribly well together. And I think that, looking back, was absolutely the right decision.
Let's go back.
Yes.
Before we go forward, your parents, tell me something about them as people and how they may have influenced you, your mother and your father.
Well, because I was born in May 1940, on the day that Churchill made his first major war speech, my father was away for most of the war, and so my mother had me, and then in 1943 my sister, as company. And I think we had a rather curious relationship because of that, because I think to some extent, as a very small child, I had to play a kind of male role in the family, which isn't really a particularly healthy one for a small boy to have to play. And I'm really just guessing at this, and from conversations with my mother before she died, is that I think that psychologically she probably lent on me more than a mother probably should with a very small child. And I always think of it in contrast to, say, the Italians, where children are spoilt, particularly boys, are given a very, very easy time from a kind of psychological point of view by their mothers. And I don't think that happened with me. And I think it meant that my relationship with my mother was always a somewhat difficult one. I mean, I know she adored me, and I think I was certainly everybody else in the family, and I have 4 brothers and sisters, always thought that I was the favourite. And of course I was the eldest. But I don't think that necessarily meant that our relationship was the best possible one we could have had.
Was she a sort of creative and intelligent person?
She was intelligent, but I don't think had really ever absolutely fulfilled everything that she could have done. She was the youngest daughter of this large family of 5 children that Cecil had. She adored her father, this saintly kind of godlike figure, but by the time she was born, he was extremely distracted with what was going on both at Whitbread's and the Bank of England. And he really gave her very little time and didn't talk to her very much, and she always was aware of it and regretted it, and felt that she had missed something so important. My father came back from the war in 1945, complete stranger to me, and I remember him walking through the gates and having potato scones for tea, and taking him up to the dressing room, and his dressing room, and showing him a piece of furniture which my mother had bought for him. And I was 5 years old at that time.
What was your first memory? I mean, not just sort of sun shining through a window, but a particular memory of an event in your childhood. I mean, it may be something you've been told later that happened to you, but do you remember anything?
The kind of crisis in my early life was when a new nanny was due to arrive. We were living in a house called Robin Lodge in Sandhurst, because my father was actually in Sandhurst as an instructor. This I must have been 4 or something like that then. And I left the house and walked down the street, and eventually found myself at the gates of Sandhurst. And the sentry on duty told me to stay where I was until he came off duty, because he wasn't allowed to move. And then when he came off duty, he found somebody to take me home. My mother, in the meantime, had actually... my father can't have been at Sandhurst. Maybe that had happened before or after, because my mother was composing the letter she was going to write to him, to tell him that she had lost me, and that she thought I was disappeared in a wood or fallen in a pond or something like that. And I do of course I've been told about that later, and I remember the new nanny arriving and having Marmite for tea, and that's about it. That's probably as early as...
And the nurse turned up and she wasn't as bad as you feared?
Probably not. I don't remember much about her now.
What was your first school? Was it kindergarten?
I went to a lovely school. I don't think it was absolutely my first, but a woman called Miss Watson, who in Barkham in Sussex had a dame's school, and I've still got some of her reports. And I thrived at that school because she was a marvellous teacher. And Barkham Mills is where Virginia Woolf threw herself into the Sussex Ouse and killed herself. It was there that I went to school. And then I went to a prep school called Spyway down in Dorset.
Spyway?
Yes.
Which part of Dorset?
In Langton Matravers, where it's in the Isle of Purbeck.
Oh, yes.
And I have very mixed feelings about that school. I think it had some good things about it.
Which were?
It was extraordinarily advanced because it really, it understood about ecological issues and being green and being natural in a way that was way before its time. But he had two headmasters, two brothers who owned the school, both bachelors, and they seem obsessed with success in games as a way of defining how successful the school itself was. And even by the time I was 13, I kind of saw through this as totally absurd. So quite a lot of the time there I wasn't particularly happy, and I was very glad to leave.
It was a boarding school?
It was a boarding school, so I'll always...
Lonely and
No, I wasn't particularly lonely, but I didn't like rugger, and we played that 2 terms out of 3. I didn't like swimming, because I found being thrown into the sea so terrifying. And I've been back to the dancing ledges, it's called, where we were taught to swim.
Dancing ledges.
And it is, if you can't swim, it is quite an alarming place to be, to have to enter the water.
Yeah, it's happened to me too.
And of course, one associates fear of water with cold as well, because the water was cold so much at the time. And the idea of a heated swimming pool, swimming pools hardly existed in the late 40s.
Were there any teachers there who you remember with?
Yes, I remember 2 very well. Well, for 3, there was Mr. Gray, who taught classics, who was a wonderful, really wonderful teacher. There was Mr. Broom, who taught geography, mathematics, and who had a famous daughter who was called Googie Withers, who was an actress and used to appear on the English stage and on radio and so on. And then there was a science master called Mr. Bailey, and I liked Mr. Bailey very much, and what really impressed me about him was that he was building a boat himself, a dinghy, which he was building in a workshop over a shop in Swanage, and we used to go and look see how he was getting on.
Were you beginning to get sort of a passion for anything at this time? Any hobbies, sort of, or collecting, or games? Not rugger, but other sort of things.
Well, I liked cricket, and I was captain of the under-11, and then the Warner brothers decided that I didn't bowl correctly or something. And managed, by the time I was 13, to put me off cricket completely, and I've never entirely forgiven them for that. I started to take photographs with a box brownie when I was 10, so I still have the negatives from my days at Spyway. And in fact, I have all my negatives going back to
that's a wonderful thing.
Yes.
You must put those on the web too.
So no, I would say books actually. Reading was probably the thing I enjoyed most.
You remember anything you read at that time?
Mr. Jeffrey would, the younger of the headmasters, with the new boys in their first winter term, would always start with Moonfleet by J. Mead Faulkner. It is still one of my favourite books. I think it is actually a really remarkable book because it's got a kind of Jungian undertone to it, which you don't realise when you're read it as a child. I've read it to my own children, who have absolutely no intention of reading it to theirs. They can't really see the point of it. I think they're wrong, as it happens, because I still think it is a wonderful book. And then we were read, I think the Conan Doyle books, The White Company. Eric, the other headmaster, read to us The White Company, which I also enjoyed very much. So being read to, I always thought was magical.
And music, were you beginning to get at all interested?
We hardly did any music. We sang, and that was about it.
So after that you then went on to Eton.
Yes.
Tell me about Eton. You're a year older than me, I think, so this must have been about 49, was it?
53.
53, I mean, yes. Yeah.
I went to Wilkinson's. I enjoyed my first year very much and thought I was doing rather well at everything. I certainly enjoyed the
Was
work.
Wilkinson's the name of a house? Or,
Yes,
yeah.
that was Dennis Wilkinson was the housemaster.
Yeah.
My second year, a lot of much larger, physically larger and very accomplished boys joined the house. It was just one of those unfortunate coincidences. And suddenly, the boys of the year before were no longer kind of the leaders. They suddenly were rather overtaken by a younger cohort.
Mm.
And I found that very disconcerting.
Mm.
And generally I enjoyed Eton, but there were parts of it I didn't, and I was quite glad to leave.
What bits did you? Was there a lot of games again, or?
Certainly the football I didn't enjoy, but I did enjoy rowing. Although I was very light, and I was quite probably too light by modern standards. But I got in the third eight, and I sculled a lot. And what I really enjoyed was just being on the river, on half days, being able to row as far up the river as you possibly could, stopping at Queen's Eight, which was an island where you could get tea. And what I think is really remarkable looking back was the extraordinary freedom we had to just set off for best part of a day on our own at the age of 14, 15. And nobody worried about us. We were just expected to kind of turn up again in the evening. And we could have capsized, been hit by other boats, we could have drowned, we could have run away. It is very different, I think, to what the situation is like now.
And were you able to go off cycling, or?
I didn't do much cycling, but I did do bird watching. I became interested in birds when I was about 15, and my housemaster encouraged me. And I have a great friend now who actually worked for the RSPB for 25 years, who was also a keen bird watcher, was in another house at Eton, and his housemaster would not allow him to go bird watching. He thought it was an excuse for kind of buggery in the bushes. And this is where Eton is so strange. You can have individual housemasters just taking diametrically opposite views on different issues like that.
Were there any teachers who you remember as being particularly formative or good teachers?
There were a lot of good teachers. I can't say that there was one teacher who changed my life, but I mean, when I became a science specialist at the age of 15, which I now think is too young to specialise, I did find it very exciting to do nothing but science for most of the time.
Music, again, was it beginning to be important to you?
Music, I learned the clarinet, but I was I never practiced, and I had very little gift for it. I mean, I had a reasonably good tone, but I never got as far as the orchestra. And I suppose I rediscovered music in a different way when I began to listen to records and began to find the kind of classical music that I liked, and then later on jazz. And a lot of the kind of contemporary pop music, because by the time I left Eton, Elvis had just was in his ascendancy. I, in a strange way, missed out on completely.
That is strange. It's important for most people, but
yes,
and the Beatles and that. Generally.
I never liked I like the Beatles more now than I did at the time. And I'd always, by the time I got to Oxford, I was very, very keen on jazz and the big bands and Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and in fact I saw all of them in the flesh in London in my in the 60s.
Is music important to you now?
Yes, to listen to.
Both jazz and classical?
Yes, very much so.
And does it help you? I mean, do you use it for unwinding or for inspiration, or?
I use it for both. I use it certainly to affect one's mood, to support. To I mean, I think music can raise one's spirit to an extraordinary extent. And then I also use it just simply as a background relief. So, for example, I was up in York. I was up in the north of England recently, and I heard Strauss's 4 Last Songs that he wrote in 1948, and the BBC had a short programme about it and why they were so important to people and so on and so forth. And I was in Carlisle in the afternoon, and I went into a shop and said, "Have you got the 4 Last Songs?" And he had a version of it. He said, "Do you know, you're the third person who's come in this afternoon. Has it been on the radio?" And I said, "Yes, it was at lunchtime." Well, I'm listening to the 4 of them now, and getting a great deal of pleasure from it, because it's for me, it's relatively new. I think I had heard them before, but now I'm listening to them properly, and they're extraordinarily powerful.
And if you had to go to your desert island with, say, two composers, classical composers, who would they be?
It used to be Schumann. I had a period of about 10 years when I'd listened to virtually nothing but Schumann. I don't think I would now. I'd find it very difficult to choose one classical composer. I mean, I'd say kind of Beethoven, Brahms and Poulenc would do very well as a trio. And as far as jazz is concerned, it would probably be Errol Garner.
Well, I think you probably, as I've never hosted Desert Island Discs, but they're usually quite lenient and allow you 3 when you they ask you for 2.
Yes.
The other thing that often happens around 15, 16 is that you're confirmed.
Yes.
Were you confirmed?
I was confirmed.
And what happened to that confirmation since? I mean, then usually at about 17, 18 you have deep existential doubts, at least I did. And
I had doubts when I was being confirmed. The actual term, or half as we call it at Eton, I think I had real concerns about whether this was the right thing to do. And I think a lot of it probably had to do with guilt about sex, sexual thoughts, and all sorts of things like that. But I can't remember very much about it. I went on. I mean, I was always happy to go to chapel at Eton because I actually liked the music, I liked singing, and I liked the sermons. I'd say one of the best things that happened at Eton was the quality of the sermons, both in Lower Chapel and in College Chapel. And we certainly had people, I remember Reindorf was one of them, who would say things which really made one think. When I got to Oxford and went straight up from Eton to Trinity College, Oxford, I don't think I went to chapel once in 3 years. I'd go to church at home when I was at home because it suited my father's church warden. He went every Sunday. It was much easier to go than not go. But I was quite indifferent to it. When through my 20s, before I was married, I never really went to church or was that interested. I then got married. We lived several miles from a church when we moved to the country. I didn't go then. And then in 1977, when I was 37, we moved to a house right next to a church in a village called Bassingbourne. And the vicar came to see me after a few days and introduced himself. And I realized with the church so close, I had to make a decision. I couldn't just be indifferent and go occasionally. I had to either say I would go or I was not a churchgoer. And I decided that I was going to be a churchgoer. And there were 2 reasons really. I'd moved into an office in Cambridge, and my office overlooked a churchyard. And I felt there was something kind of meant that I was kind of next to these churches all the time. And I'd also become interested in Jung. I'm very interested in Jung. And I remembered reading that Jung, although he was not a believer himself, found that his clients who did go to church usually had an easier time psychologically because they had something to believe in than those who didn't. So I thought that if it was going to ease one's way through life psychologically by going to church, then one might as well do so. And that's very much my attitude now. I go to church because I am interested in the spiritual side of myself. But a great deal of what the Church of England in particular says, I don't actually believe. In fact, I actually disagree with.
I mean, the central part, the Trinity and the 39 Articles and all those things.
It's both more simplistic and more fundamental than that. The thing I find the most difficult to accept in any way is this idea of the loving God, because I think it is a complete misunderstanding of what God, which I mean is only a word which we apply to something we don't understand anyway, actually is. And this idea of the Father, some kind of humanistic form bit up there, kind of looking down on us, I think is just totally absurd. For me, God is a huge creative but impersonal energy that comes from somewhere and does create, does provide that kind of, as I've already said, creative energy whereby things do come into being. And the idea that God's sitting up there saying, I'm really sorry about those 5 soldiers who were killed in Afghanistan, is and this constant concern of clerics as we've got to explain why God allowed the Holocaust to happen, or we've got to explain why the tsunami happened and all those people suffered. There's nothing to explain. I mean, it has happened. It happens, and God, the creative energy that to me is God, is impersonal. It has no. It's not a kind of thinking creature.
It's much more like Einstein's answers to questions when he was asked about it. You know, that there is something which we can't understand, but it's not in any human form or shape.
Exactly.
And does that mean that the whole kind of Dawkins attack on religion is irrelevant to, as far as you're concerned, because science can't disprove this kind of entity or non-entity that you're talking about, and
I think
can't disprove religion.
Yes, and Dawkins, I have met him at Oxford. He's obviously a very, very interesting and attractive and lively man, and I think one should read his books and look at it from his point of view. But it's irrelevant to me because my reasons for going to a church or singing a hymn are so totally personal that I don't have to explain it to Dawkins or anybody else. I just do it. And if it gives me some kind of comfort and rebalancing within myself, well, that's good.
Right, Oxford, Trinity.
Yes.
What did you study?
I read geography, which was a compromise. I wanted to read chemistry, well, that had been the original plan, and then Eton lost its nerve because Eton science was considered to be very poor in the late 50s, mainly because they didn't have proper labs and so on. And Manchester Grammar science was considered to be very good, and there was a view that 58 in particular, when there were people coming from who had done national service were coming up to Oxford, and the first stream of boys coming and girls coming straight from school. It was actually quite difficult to get into Oxford that year, though I don't think my children ever quite believe that. And as I say, Eton lost its nerve and said to my father, you know, your boy, I don't think is going to make it. Can you find something easier for him to read? Or anyway, that's how my father interpreted it. So, as you could in those days, he went to the president of Trinity, Arthur Norrington, and said, what can my boy, who's got a science background, read? And Norrington said, agriculture, forestry, or geography. Well, I've always hated farming. Forestry, I think, would have been a good but rather narrow choice. and I chose geography, and it was probably a mistake. I would have been better off reading English or history, but I would have had to have worked a lot harder, and I hadn't got that background anyway because I'd given up English and history at such an early age.
Again, in Oxford, any highlights, any particular friends or particular teachers who?
I don't think I was particularly inspired by the teaching, but I did read a lot just for my own pleasure. So the French symbolists was something that I was interested in for a time, and I read more of the classics then than I've probably read since. And people like Robert Graves and I'm trying to think of some of the other authors. So, and I enjoyed rowing. I enjoyed the social life. Girlfriends were very, very important to me because I think I was really too young to go to Oxford. It would have, I'd have been better off to have waited a year or two, or had a gap year.
And jazz.
And jazz, yeah.
Music.
Yeah, though I wasn't playing anything by then.
But there were no contemporaries who you became close to, or?
Yes, I had a great friend who I'd been at Eton with, Roger Daniel. We shared a room, and I mean we're still very close friends. And I made another friend, somebody called Dickon Hesketh Pritchard, who later went to America and is now an oil engineer in Houston, but was a brilliant engineer, but unfortunately got sent down for not attending lectures and doing his exercises.
It's a precedent. I was at Oxford, you never went to lectures or?
But if you were an engineer, because the engineering school was considered to be expensive to run, if you didn't make use of it and didn't do whatever you were supposed to do, you did actually get sent down. And after a couple of warnings.
So you stayed there till 61?
Yes.
Right? So we overlapped 1 year, I think.
Right.
Third year. We never met. What then?
Well, the big discovery for me had actually been at Eton when I was 17, and I walked into a shop just over the bridge in Windsor and is a book and magazine shop, bought a copy of Popular Photography Annual, which was an American publication just full of the best photographs of the year. And for some reason, which I still can't understand, it was an absolute revelation. I had never until then understood what photographs could be like. And this is both a mixture of documentary photographs by the kind of great life photographers, and fashion and glamour and all types of photographs. And I just thought, this is what I want to do. I want to be a photographer. And my grandfather had had a darkroom up in Scotland. I had actually developed films when I was kind of 15 or 16. So I began to do my own developing and printing. My grandfather had given me a Kodak folding camera, which took 620 or what we call 120 film now. And I used that for a number of years. And then when I got to Oxford, I went on taking photographs, bought different cameras. I think the big mistake I made was not to get involved with some of the Oxford magazines and take photographs for them. And looking back, I don't know why I didn't do that. Perhaps it was lack of confidence, lack of something. But I took a lot of photographs then. I've printed quite a lot of them recently and given them to Trinity. And it turns out that Trinity actually had very few photographs of students at that time, and so they were very pleased to have them and recently had an exhibition of them.
Was this when you started photographing in the Pitt Rivers?
Yes.
I remember you telling me about that.
I photographed, the Pitt Rivers Museum made a tremendous impression on me when I walked in there.
Is this
in 58.
The physical side or the anthropological? museum?
The University Museum itself, with its extraordinary ironwork,
Yes.
and those great dinosaur skeletons, still I think are one of the most startling kind of juxtapositions you could find anywhere. And then to walk on into the Pitt Rivers Museum lies behind it. It wasn't just the contents of the museum, it's the impact of having the material presented in that way. And the fact that it's hardly changed is one of the best things that has probably happened in the last 50 years. We did anthropology as part of geography, and I did briefly think of being an anthropologist.
Did you?
But when I discovered that it meant staying on for an extra year, I think I thought better of it. And I don't think I ever really explored it.
Who taught? Did you go to any lectures by
Yes, and the tutor I had, you'll probably remember, he had a withered arm, and I simply cannot remember his name.
Oh, yes.
Quite a not fierce exactly, but uncompromising man, I seem to remember.
I remember someone with a withered arm, but I can't remember who it was.
Roberts? No.
You weren't lectured by any of the sort of great figures, the Evans Pritchards and
they were probably,
Godfrey,
and I probably took it all entirely for granted.
Because they were around at that time.
Yes, indeed.
Radcliffe Brown even, perhaps. Radcliffe Brown had gone actually then by that. So you were sort of doing amateur photography while you were an undergraduate, and then you decided you want to be a photographer. So how did you train?
Well, I wrote, before I left Oxford, I looked at the magazine, what I thought were the best magazines being published as far as photographs concerned, and there was Man About Town, which was owned by Michael Heseltine, and there was Queen magazine, which was owned by Jocelyn Stevens. So I wrote to each of them. Michael Heseltine replied almost immediately, said he hadn't got a job, but at least he was courteous enough to reply. And Jocelyn Stevens, just after I finished finals, sent me a telegram saying, come and see me immediately. And he had another magazine called Go, which was a travel magazine, and the editor, he had just fired the editor, and the editor was having relationships of various sorts with most of the female staff, so they all resigned en masse. And Jocelyn suddenly found that he hadn't got anybody working for that magazine, so he did what I've done many times. You go through your own old personnel files, look at the job applications, and then phone the people or get in touch with them. It doesn't work because they've usually moved on by then. Anyway, I was interviewed and offered a job at £8 a week as an editorial assistant, and I started work a few weeks after I left Oxford. So I had no summer vacation or the usual break which people expect to have. But that suited me.
In London?
In London. I was longing to get to London. I'd had enough of Oxford by the end of 3 years. And I felt that London was where it really happened.
At what point did you meet Angela? It was after this?
Yes, I worked on the magazine for about 2.5 years, and I actually moved from writing, being on the editorial side, where the new editor, did allow me to take photographs as well. And I then moved to the studio, where I worked as a darkroom assistant some of the time, and then out taking photographs the rest of the time. And I also did some freelance work in my own time, in that I had a girlfriend who was a fashion editor of The Scotsman, and she gave me jobs, and I got jobs from different other people. Organisations would ask me to do something, and in those days being a freelance photographer was actually quite easy. And the extraordinary thing about photography in around 1961-62 was it wasn't even a craft, it was a trade. And apart from the fact that Tony Armstrong-Jones, who obviously married Princess Margaret, had made photography more fashionable, more respectable, generally photographers were not recognised as anything terribly special. And then of course there was the kind of new wave, and there's the Antonioni film, and suddenly in the mid-60s David Bailey and people like that, photography became fashionable.
Mm.
And everybody wanted to be a photographer. And frankly, it's got more difficult and more competitive ever since.
And more unionised in a sense.
No, I don't think it's unionised, but I think it's a very, very tough now.
But for a freelance photographer, is it possible just to take photographs and to send them off to a magazine? And
yeah, I walked into the Evening Standard for a job application, was interviewed by the editor, and I said, show me some photographs, and I had a photograph of a actress whose name I can't think of at the moment, I'll think of later, and he bought it and published it in the Evening Standard the next day.
But when was this?
By 1962.
Yes, but I mean now, or
now,
20 years later, it'd be much more difficult.
Well, the problem now is there's so many fewer publications.
Mm.
One of the great things about the early 60s was the number of newspapers and the number of magazines.
Mm.
And then when commercial television started in the mid-60s, many of those magazines and newspapers disappeared. And of course there's another wave of disappearance now because of the internet.
Mm. How long did you go on?
Jocelyn made me redundant. It wasn't called that then. I was fired in summer of 1963, about the time of the Perfume affair. And there was certainly, it was a great sense of extraordinary things are happening this summer. And I went to work for John Hedgecoe, who was a photographer, well-known photographer, as his assistant. And I then decided that I didn't, at the age of 23, that I didn't want to be a photographer any longer. And I had a kind of insight of that at the age of 40, I couldn't, with a family, I couldn't see myself as a photographer, earning enough, or I couldn't see it working. And the other thing was, I had also made a decision or judgment, correct one as it happens, that I was not going to be one of the world's great photographers. And the person I would have measured myself against was the American photographer Irving Penn, who died a few weeks ago at the age of 92, and who I think in many ways is still certainly one of the 3 or 4 greatest photographers that there has been. And I have 2 of his photographs, which I've bought in the last few years, and he's just has a gift that very few people have. And I think that making those kind of judgments when you're young is actually right. People often say to younger people, you shouldn't make kind of life-changing decisions when you're 17 or 20 or 23 because you haven't lived long enough to really understand what you're doing. I absolutely disagree with that. I think one can have an intuitive insights into what is right for oneself at an extraordinary early age. I certainly did at 17 when I told my housemaster I didn't want to work in the family firm, and similarly when I decided that I didn't want to be a photographer or earn my living as a photographer. So John Hedgecoe wanted to start a shop and selling the things that go inside a house, which, for want of a kind of better way of describing it, was really the precursor of Habitat. And John was a friend of Terence Conran, and there was a whole wave beginning then, this is 1963, of a movement against the stainless steel and teak, which had been the fashion of the previous 10 years, towards butcher's aprons, enamel coffee pots, kind of Spanish folk carpets from Casapupa and places like that. And we were the pioneers. John, who had a great energy and, as a photographer, extraordinarily good eye, knew exactly what he wanted to do, and I was the stooge who was hired to kind of run the whole thing. But I was a shareholder, and I put some of my own money into it, and for the next 3 years I ran what became 2 shops called Abacus. We got a great deal of publicity, and we made very small amounts of money, but enough to kind of pay me and get by. And then at the end of 3 years, so when I was 66, I'd got heartily tired of the whole retail business, which I realised was not for me. And John had become the first professor of photography in the UK at the Royal College, so he was totally taken over by that. And we sold the shops, and I had to find something else to do. Well, I was still in my mid-20s. I was 26 when we sold the shops. I'd met Angela, who became my wife a year later, who had actually managed one of the shops for me. And but I couldn't think what to do with what I wanted to do. And so for a time I actually tried to write television plays, and I had a completely misplaced ideas of how one did this. I thought that you could write. I discovered that time they were paying about £900 for a 1-hour play, and I reckoned that I could write one play a month, and therefore if I wrote 12 a year I would actually become quite wealthy. So I went to a bedsitter in Notting Hill, and I wrote the first play in the first month, sent it off to the BBC, wrote the second play in the second month, sent it off to the BBC, by which time I'd had a reply to say the first play was very, very disappointing. It was very poor, but put more politely than that, but try again. I then got the next letter to say that the second play was much, much better, but not quite good enough, but to go on trying. And then I wrote a third play, which I sent to Granada as well. And unfortunately, by that time I'd discovered Pinter, probably 10 or 15 years after everybody else. And my attempt at a kind of Pinteresque type of dialogue didn't work at all. And both Granada and the BBC told me that my third play was just very, very disappointing. But by that time I had virtually given up anyway. And the day I opened the Daily Telegraph jobs page, the spell was broken, and I found it very difficult to stay to the writing regime. But it was a great experience, because what it taught me two things. First, that writing as a living is probably the hardest thing that anybody could do. To be faced with a pile of A4 paper every single day of your life, and to have no other distraction, nothing else, except to write, I think is extraordinarily difficult and very, very hard work. It also taught me what wonderful places offices are, because they are so socially interesting and so companionable, and there are so many distractions to ensure that you don't actually have to do hard work for more than a few minutes at a time. And that's certainly been my experience of office life ever since. So I got a job, and I found myself, well, I actually got a job as a salesman, working for a...
You were going to disguise that fact.
I was, well, I don't want to get into too much detail. It was for a company owned by Clive Labovitch, and it had been owned by Michael Heseltine, so called Cornmarket Press. And Clive and Michael had split up by then, and Michael had gone off with Haymarket Press, which is still a very, very successful large publishing group, which he's still chairman of. And Clive Labovitch, who died some years ago, was building up Cornmarket Press, which published things like the Directory of Opportunities for Graduates, which a lot of people will remember, Which University, still being published. And it was a great place to work. And the reason I remember it particularly, or why it's particularly important to me, was because one day Clive called me into his office and said that he wanted to branch out into what was called reprint publishing, reprinting out-of-print books for libraries. And I thought I knew what he meant, because my brother had worked for the Trianon Press in Paris, which did very, very fine facsimiles of Blake's works and so on. And he said, no, I don't mean anything like that. These are just straightforward offset litho reprints for the library market. There is a huge demand. There are very few British publishers doing it. It's mainly American and German publishers providing these out-of-print, new editions of out-of-print books. I think we should be doing it. Cornmarket Press was making a lot of money at that time from their directories. They had borrowed money from a merchant bank who were encouraging them to expand. And the problem was the directors didn't really know what to diversify into, and they made quite a lot of errors of judgment in what they did go into. The reprint publishing division was the right decision. They probably chose the wrong person to run it. To choose somebody who knew absolutely nothing about it at all.
That was you,
which was me.
Yes.
When the board of directors knew nothing about it either, was actually not a good management decision. And I found that I was quite vulnerable, quite exposed when I realized within a year or so that this was a much bigger industry than anybody had appreciated. It was very much American dominated. And I had nobody I could turn to who could give me guidance or really tell me what to do. And I went to Atlantic City for the American Library Association summer conference in 1969, I think. And it was an absolute eye-opener. I just realized that there were these big concerns out there doing this on a much, much larger scale than us. And that I was working for the wrong people. And so I actually got hepatitis in early 70, and it ended up with me being off sick for quite a long time. I came back, had a row with the managing director, got fired, and went to work for Walter Johnson, who owned Academic Press and Johnson Reprint Corporation, which was the largest of the reprint publishers. And I worked in the Academic Press offices in London, but paid out of New York by Johnson Reprint Corporation. By that time, the whole of Academic Press and Johnson were owned by Harcourt Brace. Walter Johnson had just sold to Harcourt Brace for really a huge sum of money. And it was not a very happy company to work in, because Charles Hutt, probably the best, finest publisher I've ever worked for, and Johnson didn't get on at all well. And this kind of reverberated throughout the company. And to some extent I was public enemy number one, because I was the Johnson representative in the Academic Press offices. But I put up with that for 3 years and learnt an awful lot about the business in those 3 years. Became interested in microfilm as a publishing medium, because the economics of reprint publishing had meant that it was actually very difficult to make money out of reprints by 1972-73. And I decided to leave Johnson in 72. And by that time I'd met a book dealer called Hans Fellner.
Right here, yes.
And Hans and John Hedgecoe, that probably had the two kind of most formative influences on me.
He was a delightful man, wasn't he?
Yes. And he'd come to England in 1939 as a young teenager, and set himself up as a bookseller sometime after the war, and was extraordinarily knowledgeable and spoke many languages, and was your archetypal bookseller, actually. And I forced Hans to be a director of the company, gave him some shares, tried to involve him, engage him in it. And he was one of those people who didn't really ever want to be part of an organization. But we got on very well, and I used to listen, take his advice on almost everything. And certainly I probably wouldn't have started Chadwyck-Healey if I hadn't had Hans to advise me. And so in January 1973, I started my own company, which was a logical thing to do, because by that time I was making the editorial decisions at Johnson. And I had got colleagues in the States who were doing the same thing, but that was my main role. Yes, so that was my main role, and I knew that if I didn't get it right, then I'd be the first one to go. So I thought, if I'm going to take these kind of decisions, I might as well be taking them for myself. And the great thing about microfilm as a publishing medium was that you just made a negative. You photographed the books or manuscripts or whatever they were once, and then you made copies to order. So you didn't have that publisher's problem of having to invest in a stock of copies, which might take years to sell. Hans wasn't very interested in microfilm as a medium. Walter Johnson definitely wasn't, which is why I could not have done that at Johnson Reprint Corporation anyway. But I think, with my photographic background and not having been a publisher, not having been a book publisher, I've never had that great love of the book as a medium that most publishers have, whereby they can't conceive of publishing in any other medium. And I have often found the attitude of other publishers towards things like microfilm, CD-ROM, extremely precious, because at the end of the day, what you want to do is have ways of distributing information in a way that people can read or use.
So you're quite positive about the new developments now in e-publishing and Kindle?
Absolutely. The ones that work will remain, and the ones that don't will die. And I don't particularly care what format people read things in, providing they go on reading or listening or just viewing. I think that the new formats are probably even better for images, because we've all seen our own photographs on our computer monitors often look better when they're backlit than when we see them in print form.
So when you set up the company, I mean, how did you get the capital to?
I was very fortunate in that there was a family trust which we had only been given access to about a couple of years before. And it was through the fact that Morgan Grampian, which was the old family company, which had been a public company, quoted on the stock market since the 30s. The company had done, the share price had gone up substantially under the direction of a young managing director called Graham Sherrin, who is still around. He founded and runs a publishing group called Centaur. And Graham was a brilliant young publisher, and my father took him on as managing director at the age of 28 in 1968. And if I had been at the company, then I would have been 28. I was 28 rather than 1968, and I think I would have found myself in a very difficult position, because the company had at that time run out of steam and was going nowhere, and it needed somebody vigorous and with a lot of ideas to come in and shake it up, which is exactly what Graham did. And I was very, very pleased that I wasn't part of it, but I was a shareholder. So I was able to start my company with, I think, £20,000, which was the money I was able to take out of this trust.
It's quite a long history before you sold the company, in about 97, wasn't it?
99,
are there any particular highlights? There was a change from microfilm to microfiche. Was that significant, or what else?
There were a lot of highlights, because really starting the company, building it up, working in it for best part of 30 years is the main part of my life, and I identify myself with that company and what it achieved, what we achieved very closely. The turning point was when we started to microfilm the 19th century parliamentary papers in 1979, because between 1973 and 79 we didn't really make any money. We always were short of cash in the way the small businesses are. And however much we grew, we always seemed to never have quite enough cash coming in to enable one to go on and do the next thing. And I used to look at the books and think about why this was so, and not really understand the dynamics of a business which is growing but is constantly having to reinvest everything that it earns, because it's only getting paid after it delivers the finished product to the customers. And then I then realized that what we needed was something on a much, much larger scale, because microfilm was a scale business. You couldn't make it work if you produced just one reel of film, one microfiche, because the number of copies you sold was so small. If you've had 500 reels of film selling for, I don't know, 50 pounds a reel, you then had a £2,500 unit. And if you sold 10 copies of that, you had £25,000, and the thing began to kind of make sense. And we were breaking even at something like 3.5 copies. So, we're talking about tiny numbers of sales. And the 19th century parliamentary papers is something like 6.25 million pages. And so it went on to about, I don't know, many thousands of microfiche. I ought to be able to work it out. There's approximately 100 pages of microfiche. We formed a consortium of libraries in Britain the point of producing it was because the original sets in places like Oxford and Cambridge were deteriorating because they were printed on acid paper, particularly from the mid-19th century onwards. And if you were a library which had a set of the original, rather than being an asset, it was actually a huge liability, because it probably needed so much money spent on conservation. And there had never been a microfilm edition. So we produced a microfiche edition. 20 libraries in the UK subscribed to it, which gave me enough money to cover all the costs. And then our Japanese agent placed an order for 5 copies, but at a much higher price. So the thing was in profit before we started. So at last I had a project which was a sufficiently large scale to enable me to also begin to do all our own production. So we set up a separate production company in Bassingbourn, where I lived, in one of the buildings I owned, and produced it there. We had a staff of 30 almost from day one, just doing microfilm production, microfiche production. And the big change that happened in early 1980 was partly due to Maggie Thatcher cutting back university budgets, the second oil crisis, creating real problems in not only in higher education, throughout the economy. The librarians who'd actually signed up to this legally binding contract to take delivery of and pay for this film over the next 3 years decided that they needed to get the money out of their budget, out of there and into my hands up front. So suddenly I was getting these cheques for £12,000, £12,500, and for the first time the company had a lot of money. And from that day onwards, early 1980, we never looked back, because we had discovered that if you published something that was expensive enough and essentially had to be over £5,000, libraries, and you announced it before you published it, usually with a pre-publication offer, libraries all over the world would not only order it pre-pub, but they would also pay for it. And by the mid-80s we had £1 million in cash, and this is a time when interest rates were kind of 16-18%. So it changed the whole nature of the business, because we always had enough money. But we didn't have to pay much tax because the money didn't actually belong to us. It was usually prepayments for things that we hadn't yet produced. And so in theory, at any time, those libraries could have asked for that money back. But fortunately, they never did.